Welcome to Loose Lips. This is CTV's current affairs show for women, and our very special guests tonight include Joanne Nielsen. Hi Joanne, thanks for joining
Vanessa,
us.
thank you for having me.
Now Joanne is an award-winning hairdresser. She has published a couple of cookbooks. She's worked as an entertainer and a broadcaster for 33 years. She's 51, would you believe it? Married with 3 dogs and is a transgendered role model. So we salute you. Thank you very much for coming along, Jo. Cheers. And also welcome to Anne Nicholson. Now, Anne is the parent of a 3-year-old. She's a roller derby player, which I'd quite like to hear about later. I think you're very brave. A coordinator and educator for Qtopia Youth Group, and she's also genderqueer identified, which I'd quite like, actually. Anne, can you explain that for me?
Yep. It means that I don't identify as either female or male.
Okay.
I kind of sit somewhere in the middle, float around, have a good time.
That sounds great. Thank you very much. Okay, and of course joining us is Janice Gray. Janice, welcome back. Nice to see you. It's been ages.
Nice to see you, Vanessa. It's been far too long.
It has been a long time since I've
I'm
been on show
straight,
with
just
you.
by the by.
Well, actually, you've got to be careful how you throw "by" into a sentence.
Oh, that's right, by the by. Okay, I'm asexual.
Oh, well, okay.
Is that all right?
But you started out, but you were straight.
Well, I mean, I'm heterosexual.
Yes. Yes,
Oh,
okay.
pick one, for God's sake.
Yeah, that's right, I know. Talk about gender confusion.
Yeah.
Now, look, if you haven't worked it out,
And greedy.
if you haven't worked it out already,
Yeah.
tonight's program is all about gender. Now, this is a whole subject that we haven't covered so far. We've talked about sexuality, we haven't talked about gender, and the two are quite separate. So over the past 70 years, the meanings of sex and gender have been separated and have moved poles apart. When we talk about sex, we're referring to the biological characteristics that define men and women. But gender is much more complicated because it involves our own sense of identity as male, female, both, or neither. Well, that's the official view, but this is a bit of a spectrum. What do you guys think?
Well, I always think that sexuality is between the legs, gender is between the ears.
Now
And
that's a really good
easy way to
about it.
break up the two.
That's good, that's
yeah,
good.
because it just, what I was biologically born as and what I identify as are two different things.
Yes.
And so, and I understood that really early on. And,
Like how early?
3.
Really?
I insisted on moving into my mother's ironing room because it had roses on the wallpaper, and my bedroom that I shared with my brother had Indians and cowboys. And I didn't want to be in that room, I wanted to be in the girly bedroom.
Right.
And I was devastated when I got a football for Christmas and I wanted a doll. It made no sense to me. And there was no transgender role models, there was no one out in those days. So this was actually in here. This was mine. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know till 16 that you could change your sex. That was eye-opening for me.
Well, also, you're 51 now, so we
Yeah.
are talking like a whole
A
generation
long time ago. Yeah,
So
absolutely.
things have changed so much.
In a lot of ways, yeah, but I grew up, say, 20 or 30 years ago in rural South Canterbury. Things hadn't changed at all. There was
Right.
still no language to describe transgender. I didn't understand anything about transgender people until I left home and went to university. It was diversity where I grew up. It was whether or not you were a sheep farmer or a crop farmer or a bit of both. If you were a diverse person,
Absolutely.
if you
Yeah.
grew both. But
Yeah. And when I came out, it was still illegal to dress as a woman.
Okay.
So that was another barrier. Because when I first came out, I was attracted to boys, so I assumed that I must be gay.
Right.
But then none of the boys that I liked or my friends wanted to wear women's clothing. So I then became an outsider on that group as well. And that, then I met my first transsexual, and that was like, hallelujah.
Did it actually immediately make sense for you, or did it just confuse the picture even more?
No, it made perfect sense to me, but I was terrified that I was wrong.
Right.
And so in those days, to get hormones, you had to go to a psychiatrist at the hospital. This is in Auckland. And because they saw so few people who were gender diverse, you would have your first meeting with the students, which they didn't tell you about. And so there you are with 20 students, and I was 17, 18 at the time, and they had this 2-hour meeting with me, and they asked me all sorts of questions. And then I go in and saw Dr. Colpin, and he goes, well, obviously you're transgendered, you've got beautiful skin. And then he said, here's your hormones.
Wow.
And it was just like from that
So
moment
simple,
on,
so
it made my life so much easier because all of a sudden I had a name for what I was. I wasn't gay. I was actually straight, but in the wrong body.
Right. Now,
Fascinating.
for Anne, though, you're kind of working against a label. And so being queer identified kind of means that you're trying not to pin it down.
It's not a case of trying not to pin it down. It's a case of not fitting anywhere.
Okay.
And parts of me identify as male, parts of me identify as female, and genderqueer is just a space that gives me a bit more freedom.
So this is a really good thing to think of as a spectrum, as opposed to being one or the other.
Yeah.
Society is very big on boxes. They like to put you in a box, male, female, and really anything else just confuses everybody.
Yes.
So when you identify as, I identify as a heterosexual woman now,
Yes.
so that people understand that. But if I identified as a lesbian,
Yes.
that would confuse them completely because, well,
It
why
would
don't you
be.
just stay
Yeah.
being a boy because you can
Yeah.
sleep with girls?
Yeah.
And that's where the difference between sexuality and gender differ.
Well, now, Janice, you've found that, people try to put
Yes, I
people
do.
in boxes. So
look,
how do
I
you
want
feel
to
about it?
just relate a little experience when I was the chanteuse at Noah's by Tangy Room back in perhaps then. And
We
an
all
American
remember the
woman,
Waitangi Room.
An American woman called the waitress over and said, "Excuse me, could you tell me, is that person singing, is that a man or a woman?"
And it was important for them to know.
She wanted to know. Susie
Okay.
said, "She's a woman." "Are you sure?" says this woman. Susie said, "I bet my mother's life on it." She said, "Damn, I've just lost $10.
Really?
That's
amazing.
Convince you, yes.
You have the
Terrible.
most gorgeous, deep, jazzy voice. Were you just
I
blowing
love
them out
it.
of the... Yeah, well, you've
I
made a
love
lot of money
but
with it. So
man, I'll tell you what, the times I've defended myself, I can remember wanting to fight people to prove that I was a woman, which is kind of contrapuntal, isn't it, really? But however, yes, I have been mistaken for a bloke on many occasions, and sometimes I get called Mr. Grey on the telephone.
yeah.
And don't you find it offensive?
Nah, couldn't give a continental.
I used
What about
to.
you, Anne? Does it offend you if people come and call you Mr. instead of
No,
Mrs.?
not at
or
all. No, I don't mind either.
Doesn't bother you at all?
No.
Yeah, what's in a title?
Exactly. And
Yeah.
whose business is it anyway?
Yeah.
It's
Well,
me, it's my life.
I try to live by the theory what other people think about me is none of my business.
Exactly, that's right.
Ah,
It
that's not a bad saying. I
it
like
makes
that.
it easier.
Yeah.
It's actually really hard to do because when you are in a supermarket and people are going, "Is that a man?" And they all think you're deaf.
Yes, yes.
It's amazing, deaf and blind,
Well,
as you're trolling
that's
through.
society, isn't it?
And it is, and it's very sad that we are that focused
Yeah.
Yes.
on other people's business.
Yes.
Look, stay with us because coming up after the break, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the kind of boxes that we try to put people in, and especially how our youth are coping with this, because it's a very different world now to what Joe was actually growing up in. So stay with us, we'll
And
see you
Anne.
shortly. Welcome back. Now, just before the break, we were discussing gender and how gender is often needed to be put into boxes by people who just get confused. One of the things that's been quite interesting is since February of this year, Facebook now has over 50 different subcategories for gender, such as transgender, trans female, trans woman, trans male to female, and many other permutations as well. This is all to help users identify themselves with respect to sex and gender. Now, perhaps this is a younger generation thing, and I want to ask you about, is this important, how we actually put ourselves out publicly on Facebook, which
Yes.
gender it is?
Absolutely. We find it's really important to our young people to be able to say, this is who I am. And it may not be who they are in 6 months' time, but that's who they identify as at the moment, and that's how they want the world to see them. And to have Facebook saying to them, okay, well, you can be female or male, and that's it, was terrible. So now they can actually say, I identify as an F2M person, therefore I'm going to be able to express that on Facebook.
F2M's female to male?
male.
Okay,
Yeah.
gotcha.
Yeah. So with Facebook being able to do that, it's just legitimised themselves as people, and made life more legitimate for them.
What's turning it more into a spectrum, isn't it, with all the different sort of subcategories within a spectrum, as opposed to just being a binary, male or female.
And then there is also the option on Facebook just to opt out.
Right,
So
and
you
not-
can just put nothing, and
Yeah.
Facebook has to deal with that, so that's great.
Yeah, totally. Now, you work with Qtopia, and I know that, Joe, you've worked with Qtopia as well. Tell me a little bit about that.
Qtopia is the queer and transgender youth support network in Christchurch. So the same as Rainbow Youth in Auckland. We provide support for on a sexuality basis, and we also provide support on a gender basis. So we have two groups that run.
Now, and beforehand you mentioned about how gender and the way that you might identify with gender will change. Mm-hmm. Is that quite common going through teenage years?
I think that's actually quite common going through your entire life.
Yeah.
I know that my gender is this at the moment, but I'm not saying that that's what it'll be in 10 years' time, and it definitely wasn't what it was 10 years earlier.
Interesting. Janice, you're going,
Oh, well, I think it's fascinating, and I think these women are so brave.
Yeah.
Really? You must have gone through hell, both of you.
Yes, but I think, what's happened to me on my journey made me the person I am today, and I like who I am today, so I'm okay with that.
Congratulations.
But I've never, once I transitioned, that was it.
Yes.
There was no, my box, I'm very happy in my little box.
Yes.
Right.
I identify as female, and when I need to identify as a trans woman, but I am female first and foremost. I mean, I had my surgery when I was 22.
Gee.
So, nearly 30 years ago. So I have lived more of my life as a woman than I did male.
Right.
And I wasn't a very successful male, really, because I had a whole lot of stuff going on.
Yeah.
And the gender reassignment surgery is the only, transsexualism is the only mental disorder, as it was categorised, that is actually cured by surgery.
Well, now, there's an interesting... there's Kim Petras is an aspiring pop star in Germany, and actually, I'm not sure here if he or she.
She.
So she now. So
Yeah.
he had reassignment surgery to become female at the age of 16. Yes. Do you feel that's a bit young? Or is that me judging that 16's a bit young?
Yeah, it's totally up to the person and the medical team that they're working with.
Right.
There will be years of therapy to make sure that this person has made the correct decision, that it is the correct decision for them. In the 70s, when they were doing surgery in New Zealand, a number of people committed suicide because you could just pay and have the surgery.
Oh.
Okay.
And because you weren't having all the follow-up work with the psychiatrists and everything, they were unhappy being gay, so they had surgery, thinking that would be the cure.
Yes.
But if you're not transsexual, that is not the cure. That is just adding, salt to the wound, really.
I see, when I read the newspaper too, there's not much funding for the operations, is there?
I think it's
Is it two a year at the moment?
2 female
Two.
and 1 male.
Throughout New Zealand?
Yes.
That's not fair.
But at the moment, they've got no surgeon.
The surgeons are
effectively,
retired.
there's
Oh.
Yeah.
So we're having to head offshore?
Yes, but the government doesn't fund that.
Right.
So it's
Yeah.
all private funding.
I mean, it's difficult.
But the government haven't really funded it successfully ever. In the UK, you can go on to National Health,
Yes.
but that is a very long waiting list.
Yes.
So you have, if you want it, and you have the means to have it, then you still have to go through all the psych evaluations and everything.
Yes.
But you have to pay for it yourself.
I see.
Now, I think that was quite interesting, a lot of the research, and we're talking about sort of operations and all that kind of stuff, and science has come a long way to make life a lot easier for people who haven't been able to identify with that binary male or female. But researchers, they're spending a lot of money and a lot of time trying to identify this. Now, it was a while ago that Alfred Kinsey created a sexuality scale, and it ran from stone cold straight to full on gay with steps all the way. We've talked a lot about the spectrum already, but not everybody agrees with that. Is it important that we do have this kind of blended option of where we sit on the scale?
Well, that doesn't work for gender, don't forget. That is only sexuality.
Ah, okay, yeah. So is that what you were about to say, Anne?
No, I was just going to say that there's so much movement within it that we can't put somebody on a spectrum somewhere and say that's that person.
Right.
If you have a spectrum like that, it's got to be flexible and.
Well, Columbia University have they've actually brought out a test that they can test if you are gay or straight.
Oh.
And they have proved it, and they're one of I think they're the first university to actually do it. And it's a test you can go and have, and it will tell you basically where on that spectrum that you sit, whether you are 100% gay or 100% straight.
At that time in your life.
At that time, well, yeah,
Well,
but not everybody changes. That's the thing. I mean, I have always liked sleeping with boys.
So you've been a very clear-cut case right from the start.
Yes.
But then, Anne, you've changed a
Yeah,
lot.
I kind of zipped all over the place and floated in the middle, and
Yeah.
there's no fixed place that I seem to have stopped at.
Janice, as a straight woman, how do you feel? Do you feel that you need to have this kind of, space within the spectrum?
I'm just living my life, mate, I mean, a little old lady from Pasadena. Not
Is
much
there
going on,
Pasadena
really.
Yeah.
Gloucester Street, Duchess of Gloucester. Really.
Of course, darling.
I just accept who I am. I've always been straight. I mean, I have lots of lesbian friends and gay friends. I don't.
You're an icon. You're an icon amongst the gay community, though.
And I've got a transgender friend and another one now, and a queer friend. Yeah. So it doesn't worry me. I mean, as long as you don't frighten the horses and do no harm, I think a person should be allowed to live any way they choose.
This is fascinating. I'm thoroughly enjoying this. Stay with us. Coming up after the break, we're going to talk more about gender. See you soon. Welcome back to Loose Lips. We're talking gender on tonight's show. Now, some people choose not to choose a gender at all and take an androgynous approach to their identity. In much the way that a lot of life is, music and fashion leads the way. Pop star David Bowie in the 70s kicked open the door for men to feminise their look and embrace their inner female, and there have been a lot since too, of course. The fashion world has completely embraced the androgynous look, and for quite a long time too. But lately, in the fashion recently, young male and female models are deliberately chosen for their interchangeable looks. Most recently, Bosnian model Andrea Pecic, please forgive me if I pronounced that wrong, was discovered as a 17-year-old, and he started modelling both menswear and womenswear while still a man. I'm getting confused within the genders myself. While Andrea was still a man, she was cast as a bride in Jean-Paul Gaultier's 2011 Spring Haute Couture show. She's now had reassignment surgery to complete the transition to being a woman and hopes to break into modelling in the beauty and cosmetics industry. This can get awfully confusing when you suddenly have people that are changing sides.
In the 50s, there was a law brought out in France that transgender people couldn't model, or transsexuals couldn't model, because the models were so beautiful, and they had this boyish figure that the designers loved because, the unfortunate bumps and everything.
Yes.
Well, they got in the way of all the gorgeous clothes.
Made their frocks look out of whack.
Yeah.
So there was a rebellion, and there was a law brought into place in the 50s that men couldn't model as women.
Wow.
So, Andrea is not the first. Caroline Cossey was a Bond girl, and that became very scandalous when they found out that she had been born a he. But when it was still a very famous model in the 70s and 80s.
Think Boogie Street, Singapore.
Oh,
Boogie Street, remember?
absolutely.
And the Thai lovelies.
Absolutely.
The Whakaini.
Yeah.
Gorgeous.
Well, and when you look at the whakawhine and the whakalaity, etc., there's a whole community that goes back hundreds of years, and it is accepted in their society as part of the norm, because some boys are just feminine and some girls are just, butcher. It's just how it is.
Yes.
My goodness.
Confused?
Yeah, well, it's
So is everybody else.
It's very easy to get confused, but then that's one of the benefits of being able to do a show like this, isn't
Absolutely.
it? Is that we can talk about this,
Yeah.
and we can sort of mess it up, because a lot of people must be a wee bit shy about saying Mr. or Mrs. Do you find that, Anne? Have you had people come up to you and go and stumble and not quite know how to?
Yes,
Yeah.
I have in the past, especially when I used to do things like binding. I don't do that so much now, but that would often confuse people, and you just get them or it or something like that, and that was all fine by
You
me.
need to explain binding.
So binding is where you strap down boobs so that you have flat chest.
I can remember Yentl from when I was a kid,
Yes.
and that's and that was purely, she wasn't transgender at all. She was just trying to get an education.
Yeah.
However, those kinds of issues of male female, I can remember that from being, and I must have been only sort of 8 or 9, so that was quite
It was in the
impressionistic.
80s. Yeah. Barbra Streisand.
Yeah, amazing.
And stories like that are all based in reality. There is, there was a famous surgeon in the Crimea War, and when he died, they found out that he was actually female. and he'd gone through medical school and everything.
Yes.
And it was just, if that was your passion, if you wanted to be a doctor, you couldn't be female as well, because, you know, that little bit of extra skin makes you so much more intelligent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing, isn't it?
I know.
Yeah, yeah.
You should write a book.
Yeah.
Well, now none of this is new, and in fact,
No.
I wonder if over the last century, sort of in the especially sort of post-war era through to perhaps the 1990s-ish, has actually been one of the tougher periods for people, because in past societies it wasn't so strange to cross-dress. So, do you think perhaps this has been a difficult century? And we're
Yes
coming
and
out the
no.
other side of it now.
Yes and no, because when you look back at 1921, when the first gender reassignment surgery was done on Lily Alba in Denmark,
Yes.
and that basically went unnoticed. And it was until the 50s when Christine Jorgensen had her
Yes.
surgery, and she went from a GI to a girl, and that was
Yes.
like the headlines. And she was paraded.
What's a GI?
An American
military.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
I
he
see
was
what
an
you mean. Okay.
army boy,
Yeah.
Right.
basically. And Christine Jorgensen was feted around the world.
Yes.
You know, it wasn't a proper party until Christine was there. She was like the poster child for it. And that was one of the first real images that made it internationally. And she was very famous. We, of course, had Carmen in the in the 60s and 70s,
Yes.
you know. And Carmen was very forward in her thinking with all the things she stood for. But she was also, she used shock value.
Yeah.
So she'd drop her top on the steps of Parliament or at the races with the Prime Minister.
But then we've had Georgina Beyer as well. You know, so perhaps New Zealand is actually quite forward thinking in areas of gender and sexuality.
We actually are, New Zealand as a whole is incredibly accepting if they think you're a good, honest person.
Oh, yes.
It's when you're trying to fool somebody, or or if they think you're dishonest,
Yes.
they don't give you the time of day. But if they think you're a real genuine person, doesn't matter where you sit on the spectrum, you know, you'll be accepted.
Do you think, I just want to ask you guys all, do you think it's important that we're talking about this kind of stuff?
Definitely.
Absolutely.
Yeah?
Yep.
It's interesting, Cosmopolitan magazine, which now I know Cosmo's always kind of been one of those magazines that pushes the limit. But, you know, here we're talking about fashion and music sort of pushing it. It's published its very first lesbian sex guide, and with really graphic descriptions and explicit drawings. And all of a sudden, homosexual experiences are starting to be described in mainstream media. Now, am I sort of muddying the whole discussion because this is a sexuality issue as opposed to gender?
I think I looked at that the Cosmo thing and just yawned. I thought it
really?
actually was so.
Do you think it was just selling magazines?
It was.
Yes.
It was
Really?
straight.
Okay.
The term that came to mind was straight gay. It
Right.
was kind of like, this will sell magazines, but it still seemed incredibly straight to me.
Okay.
It was boring. And I thought, this isn't actually what life is really like. This is what some heterosexual persons
Would like
It's
to
a
think
fantasy.
lesbian,
It's
yeah,
like, you
would
know,
be.
straight men always go, their fantasy is to sleep with
Yes.
two women.
Yes, yes.
I don't think two butch lesbians would actually be their fantasy.
No. Although, no.
No?
Are you sure?
I'm pretty firm on that.
Okay, good, I'm glad.
Thanks.
I'm glad we agree.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they expect two very pretty, which has been portrayed
Yeah.
in the porn industry,
Right.
Yes.
these, you know, very over-sexualised women with the
Yes.
fake boobs and, you know, everything waxed to within an inch of its life. And they think that's what they're going to get, where in reality,
They'd be sitting in the corner bored.
going, do I get a turn?
No,
Yeah,
you
no,
don't get a
you
turn.
don't. Yeah.
Well, I've
that's
learned a
cool.
lot tonight. I
Me
think it's
too.
one of those things that the more we talk about, the easier these things are to discuss. I'm very, very pleased to have been able to have this kind of conversation here with three gorgeous women. Thank you very much for joining me. And stay with us. We've got a lot more discussion on our Facebook page and lots more fantastic subjects coming up next week in Loose Lips.
Thanks, Vanessa.